טוב, שבוע טוב, everyone, and גמר חתימה טובה לכל עם ישראל. We're going to continue from perek tet but before we do so, I would like to share my screen and within the next 5-10 minutes really go through all of the kings, Melachim Aleph, Melachim Bet, very quickly so we can have side by side. And the reason I want to do this is because we're ending Mamlechet Yisrael completely. Perek Yud Zayin, we're in Tet Zayin, but the end of our perek Tet Zayin and perek Yud Zayin is the end of Mamlechet Yisrael. So, Birshutchem, I'm going to share my screen.
Would you be able to send us a copy of that chart?
Yeah, I can take a screen. Yeah, I can send you a copy.
Reference.
Ken, Bezrat Hashem. So I'm going to go through it now. Mitsuyan. I'm going to share my screen. It'll just take a split second. Okay, so you should see a blank screen in front of you. And on top, it's Shlomo HaMelech. As we know, Shlomo HaMelech was the last king that reigned over all of Am Yisrael. And because of his terrible sins, Kadosh Baruch Hu decided to split up Am Yisrael into two, Mamlechet Yisrael and Mamlechet Yehuda. So very quickly, I really want to go through this now. Very quickly, we know that his son was Rechavam. And unfortunately, Rechavam wasn't the best king. He didn't listen to the elders, he listened to the younglings. Not that it's always bad, it's a bad idea to listen to the younglings and not always to listen to the elders. But in this case, it turns out that they led him astray and he took more taxes than he could have. And because of that, Am Yisrael rebelled. And on the left-hand side, you can see they decided to anoint Yerovam ben Nevat to be the king over Yisrael, whereas Rechavam on the right-hand side was the king of Yehuda. So we have a split. Shlomo HaMelech was the last king, and then Rechavam, the first king of Mamlechet Yehuda, and Yerovam ben Nevat was the first king of Mamlechet Yisrael. On the right-hand side, Rechavam had many sons. He had many sons. Aviyah became the king. His son Asa became the king until Yehoshaphat, which was a great king. We met him a couple of times. On the left-hand side, it's a little bit more complex. In general, Mamlechet Yehuda was more quiet during Sefer Melachim Aleph and the first half of Sefer Melachim Bet. And the reason is because most of the kings followed in the footsteps of Kadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore everything went okay for them. Not everybody did. We saw that in the last couple of chapters. Not all of Malchei Yehuda were great. Some of them were actually terrible, pretty terrible. But the exact opposite was on Mamlechet Yisrael, where they were all terrible. Starting with Yerovam ben Nevat, who really brought in Eglei Zahav, and he brought in Avodah Zarah, and later on Achav really deepened the Avodah Zarah. So he had a son called Nadav, but Nadav was murdered by a guy called Baasha, one of his generals. He killed Nadav, and he decided to be king after that. And we saw Bichlal in general in Mamlechet Yisrael, it doesn't follow the proper way of giving over the reins of your kingdom from father to son, the way we have it on Mamlechet Yehuda. On Mamlechet Yisrael, it doesn't have that. We have many kings who were generals, who were very powerful people who murdered in order to become king. And we saw that was really one of the downsides that Shmuel and Avi discussed back in Sefer Shmuel. So Baasha had a son as well. Elah was a king. He too was murdered by Zimri, and Zimri decided to take over. And at that time, another guy, Omri, also, I guess, had a little bit, was envy towards Zimri. He too wanted to take over. But at the same time, there was another guy called Tivni. Omri and Tivni. They both wanted to take over and get rid of Zimri. But Omri was successful in killing Zimri. And then later on, he was able to get rid of Tivni, and he became king over Mamlechet Yisrael. And he gave birth to Achav, the notorious king called Achav, which Eliyahu Hanavi had terrible difficulties with because of Avodah Zarah. And then later on, Elisha Hanavi took the reins from Eliyahu Hanavi in order to try to do what he can, but it was too late. The Nevuah was given, and he was the Nevuah to bring doom onto Mamlechet Yisrael, as we saw. So Achav had a son. He married Izevel, a terrible woman who brought in the Asherah, Avodah Zarah, into all parts of Mamlechet Yisrael. Achav and Izevel had a son called Achaziyahu. Achaziyahu died. He fell. If you remember, he was in the attic. He was wounded, but then he also didn't listen, and therefore Elisha Hanavi brought down the nevuah that he will die, and he dies. And then the second son of Achav, by the name of Yoram, becomes king. On the right-hand side of your screens, Mamlechet Yehuda continues to go from father to son. So Yehoshaphat had a son called Yehoram, not Yoram, the son of Achav, a different son, Mamlechet Yehuda, Yehoram. And Yehoram married Ataliah. Who was Ataliah? Ataliah was the daughter of Achav. Okay, so in a way, Yehoram and Ataliah's offspring were part of Beit Achav, even though they were ruling over Yehuda and not over Yisrael. Is something that we see later on is important for us to acknowledge and realize. So Yehoram had Achaziah. Now Yehoram, because he was married to Ataliah, but not just because he was married to Ataliah, he also was a melech ra. I blacked out Yehoram and Ataliah to show the contrast between all of the kings above him. His ancestors were Malchei Yehuda, who, whether they were great king statesmen or not, they followed the Kadosh Baruch Hu, they followed Torah mitzvot. But Yehoram and Ataliah did not, and sure enough, their son Achaziah also didn't follow in the footsteps of Torah u'mitzvot. On the left-hand side, because of everything that Achav and Izevel did in Mamlechet Yisrael, Avodah Zarah, Baal, Asherah, terrible, really bringing Elokim Achirim, which is so against our Torah. If you note, Elisha was given the nevuah by Eliyahu Hanavi to anoint Yehu to be king of Yisrael, and to take out Beit Achav, and that's what he does. He takes out Yoram, the son of Achav, and he really takes out all Beit Achav completely. We spent a lot of time showing how he went a little bit overboard. You know, he really demolished and took out everybody, even though he didn't have to take out. But he killed everyone else as well, because he also wanted power, even though he was obeying Hashem and obeying the nevuah of Elisha, who anointed him. Still, at the end of the day, power corrupts, and when you smell some power, when you're given power, and you don't follow Torah mitzvot properly, it corrupts you. And therefore, he killed everybody in his way in order to make sure that he and he alone could rule over Eretz Yisrael, Mamlechet Yisrael. On the right, you see I put an X on Achaziah because Yehu didn't spend time just annihilating and killing Beit Achav on the Mamlechet Yisrael front, but also since Yoram and Ataliah was Achav's daughter, they had kids. Achaziah, even though they were Netzer Beit David, still it comes from Achav, and they were killed as well. And Ataliah she swoops in to seize the moment, since there's no really sons who can actually take over from Mamlechet Yehuda. I mean, there actually is, but she kills them all. She kills all of the offspring of Yehoram, the brothers of Achaziah, and takes over for 2 years. The only time through the entire span of Mamlechet Yehuda, Ataliah took over when she was really not from Beit David. It was only those 2 years. Either way, Yehoram had a daughter also by the name of Yehosheva, who got married, who was married to a Kohen called Yehoyada. Very, very important. And when they saw what Athaliah was doing all the way down here, when they saw that Athaliah was taking over and killing every Zera Labeit David, they decided to try to save whoever they can. And they saved Yoash. Yoash was saved, and he was hid in a palace somewhere, but it didn't bother Athaliah to continue trying to murder and kill all of the offspring, but she missed Yoash, and because of that, later on, Yehoyada Kohen, together with some of the Bechirim from the army, they went ahead and they killed Athaliah, and Yoash became king. Yoash had a son later on who became king after him called Amaziah, and Amaziah had Uziyahu, which we discussed last week. Let's go back now to Mamlechet Yisrael. I see on the right-hand side, I also put down also, if you remember, Uzziah, El-Azar, same person. He was a Metzorah, and because he was a Metzorah, he was not able to really rule from within. He had to be outside, on the outskirts. He needed a, to live in a peaceful quiet of the, without being near people, so they don't get infected either. And therefore, his son Yotam was a king, by de facto. Later on, he actually became king after Uzziah passed away. On the left-hand side, because of Yehu's successful mission in taking out Beit Achav, in literally based on the nevuah of Elisha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised that he and his offspring will be able to continue ruling Mamlechet Yisrael. We met Yehoachaz. Yehoachaz, we saw, also tried to lachzor b'tshuva a little bit. We played with the idea that maybe he did have somewhat of tshuva in him. But the second HaKadosh Baruch Hu came to help him against Aram. Of course, he gave it all up. And therefore, Am Yisrael continued to sin. His son was Yehoash. His grandson was Yerovam Hasheni, not Yerovam ben Nevat, Yerovam Hasheni. Yerovam marvelously really succeeded in bringing back Mamlechet Yisrael to its glory. And we asked, why him? What was so unique about him? And the answer is nothing. Just HaKadosh Baruch Hu changed his tactic. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu kept on punishing Am Yisrael b'Mamlechet Yisrael for constantly going away from him, starting with Achav and through Yehu, annihilating Beit Achav because of it, he decided, let's change tactics. Instead of punishing them and killing them, let's give them everything. Let's give them Mamlechet Yisrael. Let's give them power. Let's give them land. Maybe that will help them lachzor b'tshuva, but sure enough, it didn't help at all. And Zechariah, his son, became king after him. Not until Shalom killed Zechariah, and we saw in one perek, 4 kings, murderous people decided to kill one after the other just for power. And we said the reason was because all the way up north, where Turkey is today, Mamlechet Ashur became very, very strong. And they started little by little crunching down and killing and taking out Mamlechet Aram, which was the northern borders of Mamlechet Yisrael. And because of that, Aram, who was the constant Ben Hadad, as we remember, and Hazael, the constant enemies of Mamlechet Yisrael, they couldn't defend them. They couldn't fight Israel anymore because of Ashur. So they took all their troops all the way up north to defend their borders up north, and therefore Mamlechet Yisrael had a little bit of some nachat ruach from wars, and therefore every other guy thought that he can take over, and he did. We saw how many people killed in order to become kings. Menachem was a terrible king who. When he didn't get his way, he really just decided to rip apart the pregnant women's bellies. Really horrendous acts. And he was so feared, so revered, that nobody dared take him out. And Menachem had a son called Pekachia. Pekachia became king after him. Sure enough, only for Pekach to go ahead and kill Pekachia. And that's really where we ended up last week. So if you just take a mental picture of what's going on here, you can see on the right-hand side, Mamlechet Yehuda, the kings of Yehuda were more or less God-fearing Jews. They ruled according to Torah mitzvot, besides one period of Yehoram and Achaziah, who followed Malchei Yisrael. On the left-hand side, we can see there were no good kings whatsoever. So that's where we ended. I'm just going to just show you that Uzziah on the right-hand side, his second son, Achaz also was not a good king. And we're going to read about him today in perek Tetzayin. But at the same time, on the left, I made it a little bigger, Hoshea. Hoshea was appointed to be king by Tiglat-Pileser, who was the king of Ashur. Ashur succeeded to defeat Aram and then Yisrael. And when they took out Yisrael, they appointed Hoshea the first time around. They appointed Hoshea to be the king over Mamlechet Yisrael, but sure enough, later on, it didn't work out, and all of Mamlechet Yisrael was exiled, and we lost them forever. So that's what happened on the left-hand side, and you can see Mamash. This is all Melachim Aleph and Melachim Bet. On the right-hand side, we're not going to meet him today, but Achaz, who was not a good king, had a son. His son was Chizkiyahu HaMelech, which we're going to read a lot about, a really, really, very, very special king. So, just take a mental, or just, I'll Bezrat Hashem send everybody a picture of this, but it really gives you a picture of Melachim Aleph and Melachim Bet, and hopefully it will spark all the information that we learned regarding the Melachim. During this period of time, we also saw many, many miracles. In Melachim Aleph, we saw Eliyahu Hanavi, the area of this area over here with Achav, Omri, Tivni, Achav, Izevel, and his sons. And then we saw Elisha take over really the area over here. And unfortunately, Elisha's mission was really just to bring the last nevuah of Yehu, but he tried to do his best to help those in need, and he really did a good job. And many, many miracles that we read about him. So that's what I wanted to share with you today regarding the bigger picture. So let's jump right into perek Tetzayin. Unfortunately, I'm just reminding everybody today we're ending our shiur at 6:30. The reason we're ending at 6:30 is because at 6:40 we have mincha, and I have to get the shul. I give another shiur between mincha and ma'ariv. We won't have a shiur next week or the week after that because it is already Chol HaMoed, but we will meet after that. And I think by then we have to change the time of our shiur to 8 o'clock until we switch the clocks to Sha'on Choref, which I think is the end of October. I think the 30th or 31st of October, and then we can bring it back to 6 o'clock. But Bezrat Hashem, I will look a little deeper into it and send everyone a message on our WhatsApp group before I make any final, time. I know 8 o'clock is much more difficult for everyone. 6 o'clock is easier. I would like to say 7 o'clock, but we have Tehillim at 7 o'clock, which is a very, very important group of women who really do wonderful things for our keilah, and they do it b'sheket, they do it silently, and really in bishchut nashim tzadkaniot nigalu Yisrael. And I think really, and I'm not saying this lightly, I really think our shul has been okay during Corona because of the group of women. I really do. They're wonderful, wonderful people, what they do. Tov, so perek Tetzayin. We're going to meet Achaz ben Yotam, as I mentioned before, the king of Yehuda, who was not a good king. And we see that already from the get-go. Pasuk Aleph. Bishnat 17 shana לפקח ben Remaliyahu, malach Achaz ben Yotam, melech Yehuda. Achaz and Yotam were the sons of Uzziah, Elazar. Elazar, as we remember, was a Metzorah. Therefore, he ruled, but he wasn't always there, and therefore his sons really ruled more than what we see here. Either way, he was 20 years old. Ben 20 shana Achaz במולכו, ו-16 shana malach בירושלים, and boom. ולא עשה ישר בעיני אדוני אלוהיו כדוד אביו. Goes all the way back to David. He did not follow David Aviv, but he was actually a worse king than Yoram and Achaziah. Let's read what Baal Sefer Melachim tells us about Achaz. Vayelech b'derech Malchei Yisrael. First, we know where this is going. He went and followed the footsteps of Malchei Yisrael. וגם את בנו העביר באש כתועבות הגויים אשר הוריש אדוני אותם מפני בני ישראל. ויזבח, ויקטר בממות, ועל הגבעות, ותחת כל עץ רענן. Right? He was 20 years old and he ruled over Yerushalayim for 16 years. He didn't follow the good example of David HaMelech, and he strayed far from pleasing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he followed the example of Malchei Yisrael. He even sacrificed his own son, Molech, his own son, as a burnt offering to idols. And we know that that is probably the biggest offense. We just read on Rosh Hashanah, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read about Akedat Yitzchak. We read about Akedat Yitzchak. We read that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not want anybody to sacrifice their son. A long time ago, I gave a shiur, my own chidush, that basically what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was doing is showing the whole world that he's not going to allow Avraham Avinu to sacrifice his son. Avraham is going to go up to Har Moriah and he's going to try to sacrifice his son, just like all other kings did during the time of Avraham Avinu. But the difference is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not allow Avraham to sacrifice, because Hashem does not work that way. And here we have a king. Here we have a king of Yisrael, Netzer Yehuda Achaz, who burnt his own son as an offering to idols. Really, really terrible. And then we said that all the pagan places of worship, on the hills, under every shady tree, Achaz offered sacrifice and burned incense. It's a niv. It's one of the nivim that we say in Hebrew. Tachat kol etz ranan. Really, he was a terrible king. Mamlechet Yehuda, terrible king. And I don't know if we'll have time now to discuss why he became that type of a king, but I'll just say everything that was going on historically with Ashur and Aram definitely played a part on the reasons why he strayed away. Pasuk Hey is a little bit of a difficult pasuk. I'll read it. It says the following. אז יעלה רצין מלך ארם ופקח בן רמליהו מלך ישראל ירושלים למלחמה, ויצורו על אחז ולא יכלו להילחם. Retzin, the king of Aram, and Pekach, the Pekach ben Remaliah that we met, Melech Yisrael, they decided to wage war against Achaz in Mamlechet Yehuda, but there's absolutely no reason given. Why Milchemet Achim now? What is really going on here between Mamlechet Yisrael and Mamlechet Aram? So when investigating these things and trying to find answers, you have to turn to all the different Nevi'im, Yeshayahu Navi, and Divrei Yamim, and outside sources. And it turns out that what's really going on here is that it all is surfacing because of Ashur. Ashur is becoming very, very, very strong. Tilat Pil Eser III is becoming very strong. And it turns out that Aram and Yisrael made a brit, a treaty between them to fight Ashur. And the king of Yisrael, Pekach, wanted Achaz to join in this treaty, a triple treaty, if you will, to help fight Ashur. But Achaz did not want to. Achaz wanted to side with Ashur, not with Aram and not with Israel. And because of that, Aram and Israel decided to wage war against Achaz in order to force him to side with them in order to fight against Ashur. Because again, Ashur is becoming very, very strong, and they were interested in annihilating the entire area. But Achaz sided with Ashur. And we'll see in a minute how that was also a mistake. Pasuk Vav, Ba'et hahi, Heshiv Retzin Melech Aram et Eilat L'Aram. It's really supposed to be Edom here, not Aram. Vayinashel et hayehudi me'elot, ve'edomim ba'u Eilat, vayeshvu sham ad hayom hazeh. So we see what's going on here is that people are losing power. Other kings from the outskirts are becoming more powerful than our own kings, than our Jewish king from Judea, from Yehuda, and our Israeli king. And in Pasuk Zayin, Achaz decides to make a treaty with Tiglat-Pileser. Vayishlach Achaz, Pasuk Zayin. Vayishlach Achaz Malachim el Tiglat-Pileser melech Ashur lemor, Avdecha uvincha ani, Ale ve'oshieni mikaf melech Aram, umikaf melech Yisrael hakomim alai. I'll summarize in a minute. ויקח אחז את הכסף ואת הזהב הנמצא בית אדוני ובאוצרות בית המלך, וישלח למלך אשור שוחד, וישמע אליו מלך אשור, ויעל מלך אשור על דמשק, ויתפסע, ויגלע קירה, ואת רצין המיט. So basically, Achaz made a treaty with Ashur, but he didn't just make a treaty with Ashur. He didn't ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu what to do, like all the kings beforehand. He didn't lead Yaetz to consult the Nevi'im in his day. Instead, he decided to take all of the Otzrot Beit Hashem. We know that's a mistake. We've seen that before. He takes the Otzrot Beit Hashem and he gives it as a bribe to Ashur. How dare he do such a thing? That's what he does. But Ashur is Ne'eman, and he accepts the treaty with Melech Achaz. And because of that, he fights Aram, kills Retzin, and then later on also, he demolishes Mamlechet Yisrael as well. I'll read the next couple of psukim, but then I have to end. Because of this beautiful thing that Melech Ashur did for Achaz by saving his kingdom, he goes to Damascus. And what does Achaz see? Vayar et hamizbeach asher beDamasek. Achaz sees a beautiful altar up north in the kingdom of Damascus, the kingdom of Ashur. Vayishlach hamelech Achaz et Uriah hakohen et dmut hamizbeach ve'et tavnito lemachaseu. He takes a snapshot. He does a selfie with himself and the altar that he sees in Damascus, and he sends a WhatsApp right to his buddy Uriah Kohen, and he says, I want you to rebuild the Mizbeach Nechoshet, the Mizbeach from the time of Beit HaMikdash HaRishon, the time of the Mizbeach that was in the Mishkan, and I want you to build another one that will look like the Mizbeach Avodah Zarah all the way up in Damascus. That's the kind of king we're dealing with. And sure enough, that's what he does in Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayiven Uriah Kohen et HaMizbeach, ככל אשר שלח המלך אחז מדמשק, כן עשה אוריה הכהן, עד בו המלך אחז מדמשק. And he builds it, and the king comes back to Yerushalayim, ויבוא המלך מדמשק, וירא המלך את המזבח. He sees the beautiful altar based on Avodah Zarah, based on the altar that he saw in Ashur, ויקרב המלך על המזבח ויעל עליו. Literally, he returns from Damascus, and he burns animal sacrifices and grain offerings on it, pours wine, right? ויקטר את עולתו, מנחתו, ויחזר נזקו, ויזרוק את הדם השלמים שלו המזבח. Really. ואת המזבח הנחושת אשר לפני אדוני, the bronze altar, the נחושת altar, the dedicated to Hashem, ויקרב מאת פני הבית מבין המזבח ומבין בית השם, ויתן אותו על ירך המזבח צפונה. Achaz moves it to the north side of his new altar. And the new altar, based a replica of the terrible Avodah Zarah altar, becomes the main focus of the Beit Mikdash. Finish just a couple more psukim. ויצווה המלך אחז את אוריה הכהן לאמור על המזבח הגדול, הקטר את עולת הבוקר ואת מנחת הערב, ואת עולת המלך ואת מנחתו ואת עולת כל העם הארץ ומנחתם ונזקיהם, וכל דם עולה, וכל דם זבח חלב תזרוק, ומזבח הנחושת יהיה לי לבקר. Achaz took apart the Mizbeach HaNechoshet. He removed everything, takes apart, and he orders that everything now be done on this new Avodah Zarah altar. Vayas Uriah Kohen kechol asher tzivah hamelech Achaz. Everything that Achaz told him to do, he does. ויקצץ המלך אחז את המסגרות, המכונות, ויעשר מעליהם את הכיור ואת הים, ואת הבקר, מעל הבקר, הנחושת אשר תחתיה, right? Everything else that the king Achaz did is recorded later on. ויתר דברי, he just takes everything apart, moves everything, ruins the mizbech that we had and brings in this foreign replica of a mizbech from Ashur. That's it. Vayishkav Achaz im avotav, vayikaver im avotav. Achaz dies and is buried in the royal tombs of David HaMelech, and his son Chizkiyahu bno molech tachtav. So we see right before Chizkiyahu becomes king, his father was a terrible king.